Mehdi Hasan had on Bassem Youssef in an engaging conversation to discuss the Israel-Gaza conflict, specifically around October 7th, the day that Zionists want to pretend the world began. That way they can talk about this issue in a vacuum and try to make Israel look as good as possible. And they had some really insightful commentary and facts on the matter. So I wanted to look over a few of these clips, and as always, I'll just jump in with the context and facts.
The UN says the Hannibal Directive was used on October 7th. Bassem, break down for us. You've been following this very closely over the last few months. What kind of things did the Israelis do on October 7th, which led to the deaths of their own civilians? Because remember, 1,400 is the death toll, right? It's then lowered to 1,200. Of the 1,200, 700, I believe, are civilians.
739.
And some of those civilians, we don't know how many because the Israelis weren't doing independent
but
investigation. Some of them were killed by Israel.
Here's interesting. I know there's a lot of information about this, but the fact that, as I said, one of the soldiers said, I saw a vehicle running away with the hostages, so I thought of shooting them and killing them instead of them falling in captivity.
Now, to clear a few things up before we jump in, they believe, and I do as well, that October 7th was a clear act of terror by Hamas. An act of terror in response to act of terrors, but an act of terror nonetheless. And they're not saying that Hamas killed nobody. They say both of these things in the podcast, but it wasn't in the clip that I needed to get. So I just wanted to put that on the table for their beliefs and mine, but more that the numbers that happened have been inflated, and we've been made to believe that now we can't discuss anything that would happened or that it was any different than what Israel's reported, or we're doing terrorist apologia and being anti-Semitic, and it's all a bunch of bullshit when it comes to how historical atrocities are supposed to be reported on. History is meant to be scrutinized. History is meant to be looked over and to justify or unjustify different actions. The first numbers that came out of October 7th were 1,400 dead civilians. That was then quickly revised down to 1,200, and then you find out that only around 700 of those were civilians, and it's now been confirmed that a portion of those were killed by Israeli soldiers. We'll never know how many because Israel refuses to do an investigation on it. The Hannibal Directive, what they're talking about here, is official Israeli policy that anyone can look up. You don't have to believe the brown guys talking about it. Look it up. It's Israeli policy that states they will stop kidnapping or hostage attempts by any means, even if it means shooting and killing their own people. And this is in reports, again, from Israeli soldiers. A tank commander clarifying the steps and actions he took to carry out this directive, as well as the commission verifying other cases where this was implemented. There's cases of Hamas being in houses with civilians, saying they want to surrender, they want to do a ceasefire and get out safe and sound or whatever, give up their arms. And Israeli forces just come and blast through the house, starting firefights that have Israeli civilians in the middle of it, including children, and that in these firefights, civilians also died. The families of these hostages that were in this house demand a probe to find out what happened, but Israel refuses to do so. And the reason that the original number of 1,400 was revised down to 1,200 is that they found that 200 of the burned bodies were actually Hamas. So it begs the question, first of how many other ones were, right? How many other ones were killed by Israel? These are questions that Israel doesn't want to give us the answer to, but also, why are we as a nation, America, or even internationally, not seeking out accurate reportings of this atrocity from beginning to end? We've come to the point where we don't accept police saying, oh, well, we shot the black guy because he pulled a gun. Not until we see the body cam. We want to see the footage. We want to verify it with an investigation. So why are we taking Israel at its word on its own reporting that they're using to justify their own horrendous atrocities, bombing women, children, the elderly, civilians, especially when more and more comes out as time goes on that was either wrong, completely fabricated, or just not reported on?
There's a guy called Asa Kasha who's a philosopher, Bassem. He's the guy who came up with the IDF's Code of Ethics. What's that? Code of Ethics. They actually have one.
That's the biggest geopolitical oxymoron I've ever heard in my life. IDF Code of Ethics,
and even he
in one
says,
sentence.
And even he says that, the Hannibal Directive did exist. The original order does not allow for you to kill an Israeli citizen. So he's saying he wants an investigation too. Even he thinks what happens on October 7th.
How dare you kill Israeli civilians instead of Palestinians?
The IDF is only for killing Palestinian civilians. Only. Get it right? I mean, Bassem, there are so many examples that just haven't really been covered in the West. They have been covered in Israeli media and in some left websites of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. In a statement given to an Israeli news channel, a tank driver and a commander said they targeted 2 Toyota vehicles with militants and Israeli civilians inside of them. He said, I prefer stopping the abduction so they won't be taken. I prefer killing them
And these are things that just don't get covered in Western media because America needs to push Israeli propaganda to keep up our Zionist sentiment. And this is not anti-Israeli reporting that's saying this. Again, it's straight from the mouth of those who wrote the IDF's code of ethics, straight from the mouth of Israeli soldiers who actually carried out these attacks that are saying this is what happened. Now look, what Hamas did on this day was terrible. It was horrendous. But if we say it's an atrocity, that it is, and it was an atrocity that I believe it was, we should want accurate reporting on what happened. Everyone who took part in the killing of these civilians should take culpability. It shouldn't just be pointing fingers at one side and then believing the other. We should want to know exactly what happened without being labeled anti-Semitic. And if Israel's role in its own civilians dying is bigger than they let on and want you to believe, we should all know, and they should also be condemned the same way that everyone else is willing to condemn Hamas, the way that I condemn Hamas. I think Israel deserves culpability as well if they took part, especially when they're using these inflated numbers and these fabricated stories to justify killing 30 times the civilians that died that day. 759 over 30,000.
On the subject of believable or unbelievable stories, the big one was babies beheaded.
Yeah.
40 of them.
Yes,
And
and,
this-
Joe Biden saw pictures. He said, and when the White House was asked, what about the pictures?
Yeah, they walked it back immediately. So it was this. So what I get is, and we're going to talk a little bit about Zaka.
But Biden lies the whole
By the way,
time.
let's talk about Zaka, by the way, in context. So there's a group called Zaka, for those of you who don't know, religious volunteers, ultra-Orthodox, who turn up at crime scenes, tragedies, natural disasters, collect bodies, try and get them ready for Jewish burials. But they end up wrecking crime scenes. They're not credible organizations when it comes to their testimonies. The founder of Zaka, ironically the group that has spread so many stories about dead babies and sexual violence, he committed suicide a few years ago when he was accused of mass child rape. They have a long history of being accused by Israeli media of trying to fundraise off of atrocities. And their volunteers came up with a lot of outlandish stories.
This is just another example of how Israel has tried to weaponize atrocities to then justify their own atrocities. Claims of 40 beheaded babies was going around for weeks. People still say it to this day. Biden claimed that he saw the pictures before being asked to then produce them and walked that claim back instantly almost, only for Israeli soldiers, Israeli media to come out and refute these claims and outright say they were fake. They were pushed by a non-credible Jewish organization that tries to weaponize atrocities to fundraise off of. They also push stories of sexual assault, cutting off the breast of women, gouging the father, cutting off the fingers of their child, all of which ended up debunked. And again, not by the UN, not by America, not by anti-Semites, but by Israeli media and Israeli soldiers who were there that day. However, while the initial claims went viral, while they got all the coverage in the Western media, the fact that these were disproven by Israel never did. The people who fabricated these stories have no culpability to take about this. They were just fading into obscurity. There's still people to this day, as I said, that will claim these things happen and just don't understand that, hey, these were proven to be lies by Israel. It's not just people saying, nope, not true. It's Israel that has said, hey, these things didn't happen. And yet again, just to draw another comparison, there was no outrage about the Palestinian babies that were actually beheaded in Rafah. Biden didn't come out and say, this is an atrocity. I've seen this. It's terrible. No, his red line was Rafah. And when babies were beheaded in Rafah, he moved his red line back further. It's just always, but Hamas. Well, Hamas, do you condemn Hamas? It just shows how there's one side in this conflict that is largely viewed as human in Western media, and the other is just numbers on a sheet.
The commission identified patterns indicative of sexual violence in several locations and concludes that Israeli women were disproportionately subjected to these crimes. The commission did not find credible evidence, however, that militants received orders to commit sexual violence, and so was unable to make conclusions on this issue. It says the commission has not been able to independently verify allegations of rape due to this is important, due to a lack of access to victims, witnesses, and crime sites, and the obstruction of its investigation by the Israeli authorities. So, Bassem, as you know, you've been following this for the last 8 months. The Israeli government and some of its defenders abroad, people like Sheryl Sandberg and others, have been stressing that the world has ignored the voices of Israeli Jewish women who were attacked, assaulted, taken hostage, and allegedly raped en masse, they say, on October the 7th. And some people, and I would include myself in this bucket, I mean, I would say there's 3 types of groups. There's one group of people who say, you must accept that there was mass rape on October 7th and that Hamas used it as a weapon of war. It was all part of the plan. There's another group of people who say, nobody was raped on October 7th. It's all Israeli propaganda. And there's me, And I put myself in this bucket that says maybe there was. But where is the investigation?
And I agree with Mehdi here. It's always been trust and then verify. But why can we not verify? Why in this specific situation are we not allowed to verify? My heart goes out to any victim of sexual violence. And I'm sure that there was some on October the 7th, just as Israel commits the same act to Palestinian hostages that they have to this day. However, the sentiment of sexual violence being ordered or part of Hamas as a military strategy, while also not condemning any of Israeli sexual violence and saying, oh, well, it must be a part of their strategy, strikes an eerily similar chord to how this has been weaponized throughout history, specifically against the Black community. The weaponization of gender and sexual violence against them has been heavily used against Black people to justify a multitude of atrocities, like the Atlanta Massacre in 1906, the Forsyth Massacre in 1912, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, the Rosewood Massacre in 1922. These were all started by accusations of a Black man assaulting a white woman and used to justify these horrendous acts, these horrendous killings, the destruction of Black neighborhoods, only to then find out that they were fabricated stories. So all I ask when talking about October 7th is to have a real investigation done, to actually find out what happened. If this is going to be intuition pumped by every Zionist to justify almost 40,000 dead Palestinians, tens of thousands more lost under rubble, probably dead as well. Most estimates of unverified numbers are in the six figures, over 100,000, then we at least, at the bare minimum, should actually know what actually happened. Because sometimes when the truth comes out, like in the case of the massacres I just listed, in the destruction of neighborhoods that I just listed, you realize that what's been weaponized to justify those atrocities, those unjustifiable atrocities, were fabricated because they knew they needed ground to stand on.